When you think of a kaiju, you probably think of a movie where Godzilla destroys a city and is fighting other monsters and stuff. But in the late days of the Edo period, a group of workers digging out a canal in a warm swamp would witness a monster of pure terror emerging from the mud, leaving few men to tell the tale. Welcome to Cryptid Corner, the series all things cryptids, and today we are going to look into the Kaiju of Inba Marsh. Today's topic takes us to Inba Marsh, a wetland ecosystem that surrounds the shallow Lake Inba in northern Chiba Prefecture, Japan. This wetland sits near Tokyo, which was known as Edo long ago, and due to flooding, agricultural development, and economic pressures, there have been many projects to create canals to redirect and drain water from the swamp ever since the 1700s. And in 1873, workers were creating a canal to connect Lake Inba to the Tone River. But on the morning of September 25th, workers would be confronted by a horrifying denizen of the marsh. At a rapid pace, a storm would sweep the marsh, and from the muddy waters would emerge a giant creature known as the Kaiju of Inba Marsh. And Kaiju is right, with the humanoid creature being about 16 feet long, with a gargantuan head, and which was black in coloration. The face was 6 feet long, and the jaw itself opened 5 feet wide, along with large barrel-sized eyes which shined like the light of a full moon. The creature resembled a mix between an ape and a seal, with the ape-like face and body, along with 3 sets of 1-foot-long claws, with the last claw being placed on its tail in place of a fluke tail. Once the creature emerged, it climbed atop a large rock, and out of nowhere, it would let out an immense roar that caused several workers to collapse, many dead and others ill. Following this run-in, the monster would disappear, never to be seen again, and the next year the canal would be completed. But the monster hasn't been forgotten, as in 2020, the Yachiyo Municipal Museum would display a statue of the kaiju, and it is absolute nightmare fuel. Man, there's just something about Japanese artists and just making these creepy statues. It's just, man. You know, I looked this up, and I'm immediately just jump scared by this hideous face. I mean, imagine running into this, and you got to remember this thing's like 16 feet long, and the whole head's like 6 feet long. So it's like, God. So just what the hell was the Kaiju of Inba Marsh? When wondering what type of animal it is important to note that this marsh is not too far from Tokyo Bay, and of course the Tone River does drain into the ocean nearby, meaning sea creatures could somehow wind up here. But even with this in mind, there is just like nothing on Earth that fits this creature's description. My best guess is that it could have been a surviving stellar sea cow, who could reach Goliath sizes of up to 30 feet in length. Manatees were mistaken by mermaids by sailors, though it's not the longest stretch to think that a super fat manatee could have been mistaken for a kaiju monster, especially in poor visibility when being covered up by a bunch of mud and all of the storm going on and all of that. But even taking into account poor visibility and the many degrees of exaggeration, these titans of the Pacific have been extinct for some 80 years at this point, and I'm still not keen on this theory, even if this was a surviving one. Although it is extremely cool to think about this possibility. And likewise can be said for stellar sea lion, who can reach sizes of up to 11 feet in length and closer resembles the kaiju, albeit by a little bit, making it the most likely culprit, at least in my opinion, of known animals that live in the region, but even then it is quite a stretch. This all being said, the detail of the weather changing upon its arrival and people dropping dead after it screams makes the kaiju sound like less of a cryptid and more of a yokai, supernatural beings from Japanese mythology that are more of spiritual entities opposed to cryptids, which are thought of as real creatures. And one yokai that this reminds me of is the Umibozu, a giant humanoid yokai typically encountered out at sea. Like the kaiju, the Umibozu is black in coloration with giant eyes, and both of them share the ability to summon storms upon their arrival. But with that being said, Umibozu are not known for killing people with shouts, as they tend to just look for people who are astray out at sea, and they would sink boats either by just breaking them or by demanding the crew give them a ladle, in which the Umibozu would use to fill up the ship with water. And a fun little fact, the way that you're supposed to trick them is to give them a ladle with the bottom cut out, so they just get confused, and they're like, oh, what? And then you get away. And again, Umibozu are more of a spiritual entity, and this is more of a spiritual explanation and not as much of a cryptozoological one. Personally, I think that the incident didn't happen and that this whole story was made up. There are differing accounts of what happened, with some accounts claiming that as little as 3 people collapsed after the yell, while others claim that it wiped out like 13-some people. But why would somebody create this story if it was a hoax? Well, personally, I believe that this tale is very metaphorical, kind of like the most iconic kaiju of all time, Godzilla. Godzilla originated as the personification of the power, devastation, and fear of nuclear weapons, which were unleashed upon Japan 9 years earlier, and had only continued to grow deadlier and more powerful by the day, with superpowers advancing them at an extremely rapid rate that mirrored a growing disdain for one another. So, perhaps the story of the Kaiju of Inba Marsh is a political statement for late Edo policy around land reclamation, especially from the perspective of a farmer or a more rural, conservative, traditional point of view. Many of these canals were dug up with the intent of bettering irrigation for agriculture and for commercial use, along with flood prevention and to provide drinking water. But at least in the short term, there would be many cons to these projects. As you could immediately guess, these projects would cause great ecological damage, altering the ecosystems to the detriment of animals and humans alike. The creation of these canals would also allow muddy, unclean water to circulate through the system, affecting the very farmers, fisheries, and everyday people that it was meant to aid. And the deaths of the workers could also either represent the powerlessness of men before nature, or the hardship that these workers had to undertake. Working on marshes is pretty rough, as you could probably guess, especially in Edo period Japan, with unpredictable conditions and diseases taking the lives of many who were given the assignment of restructuring the very earth around them. The dangerous conditions of the swamp are even displayed in the stories, as a sudden downpour could end up just as dangerous as a monster appearing. The monster could also represent modernization in the toll that it takes on laborers and farmers alike. At the time, Japan was still under the policy of isolationism, and many citizens found this to be a good thing, living the way that they always have. But still, many yearned for improvements and expansion in the name of progression. But as cities grew, nature began to be wiped out, making it harder for hunters, trappers, and fishermen whose way of life was being altered due to pollution and prey animals being displaced. And this would affect farmers as well, whose water supplies are basically in jeopardy of being polluted by those upstream. And of course, overwork can take anyone, especially if you were assigned with draining a swamp into a river. And also this was very dangerous too, because you're taking swamp water and you're just, flowing it throughout farms and stuff like that. So it's not even pollution in the, the traditional, like oil and all of that sense, but dirty swamp water being mixed in with water for crops and water for drinking is just not sanitary at all. And it led to a lot of diseases and many other things, at least in the short term, that were not good. The Kaiju of Inba Marsh wouldn't be the only cryptid said to call this wetland home. The initial monster would never be seen again, and over the years, Edo would become Tokyo, cities would rise around the marshland, and more canals would be dug. But at its core, the lakes and marshland around would remain. During the 2000s, something large was said to emerge from these muddy waters. This thing being the giant devil snapper. The giant devil snapper is said to be an incredibly large snapping turtle, with shells reportedly exceeding 6 feet in width, and with an incredibly aggressive attitude, attacking dogs and people. Takeshi Nakazawa would hear tales from a biker gang that he was familiar with, of giant turtles popping up around the lake, with him launching his own investigation in search of the monster snapper. But you'd only really walk away with pictures of recently hatched clusters of eggs and this picture of a really cool fish. But Nakazawa theorizes that a new species of snapper had evolved, growing large in the wetlands with no natural predator to check it. Snapping turtles and alligator snappers alike are both invasive species in Japan, as many imported them as exotic pets starting back in the 60s, but as they grew too big to care for, they were carelessly released into the wilderness, where they would continue to grow and dominate wetland ecosystems across Japan. And if you remember my Beast of Busco video, you know just how large snappers can get. As someone who lives near a pond with a monstrous snapper living in it, I know firsthand that snapping turtles can get pretty large, with me guessing that it's about 1 to 1.5 feet long. But the alligator snappers are on a whole other level, as not only do they look way more devilish, but they can reach gargantuan sizes, with the largest confirmed alligator snapper weighing in at 249 pounds, with carapace length of 31 inches. And in 1937, a non-verified account described an alligator snapper that clocked in at a staggering 403 pounds and was 6 feet wide, which is about in the ballpark for the devil snapper. But of course, taking these witness accounts into consideration, and including my own snapper run-ins, I'll have to get a picture of it sometime, witnesses tend to exaggerate their encounters. But I mean, if a 2 to 3 foot long alligator snapper started rushing you and your dog, you'd probably think that some beast from the Cretaceous was after you. So, I personally believe that these devil snappers are alligator snappers who, due to a lack of predators, have grown huge over their 80-year stay in Japan, taking notes from Gamera. But no matter how large they are, it is very likely that they're also being very exaggerated. The Kaiju of Inba Marsh is a truly bizarre story of a terrifying being of great power. Although it appears the monster was more symbolic for the dangers of modernization, clearly its message fell on deaf ears, as about 20 years later, the Meiji Restoration would see Japan go from a moderately advanced nation with a vulnerable military to an imperial powerhouse capable of defeating the Russians and catching up to European powers in the span of decades, for better or for worse. But like in the story, advancements, as good as they are, can be twisted by the ambitions of the elite, leading loyal, hardworking men into early graves after awakening a sleeping monster. Going down a steep hill can give you a lot of speed, but if you lose control, you raise the risk of a fatal fall. And that's going to do it for the Kaiju of Inba Marsh and the Giant Devil Snapper. This was a very odd story to look into, as it's very rare to see a cryptid with a body count, let alone like more of a supernatural type of entity like this. There also is said to be a story about like a golden dragon that lived in the lake, but that doesn't really fit too much into cryptid stuff. I might cover that on its own if it's significant, but it doesn't seem like too important of a tale. But I thought this was pretty interesting, and that statue is creepy as hell. And it was also neat learning more about the giant devil snapper, which actually is a pretty plausible cryptid because snapping turtles can go kinda crazy. But what did you think about it? Did you think that the Kaiju of Inba Marsh could have been a missighting of a seal and like just extremely exaggerated by someone there? Or do you agree with the metaphorical, more of it being a symbolic type of creature, not like a physical real story? And did you also think that the metaphors that I theorized were a good interpretation of the story if it was one? I'd like you to let me know in the comments down below. And of course, this was me trying to sit down and think from the perspective of, the cons of modernization, from, kind of like a very traditional way of life type of, living off of the land type of mentality. I was bound to get something kind of mixed up in this, but of course, it doesn't only apply for Japan, and it doesn't only apply for this, and it's not even necessarily my perspective on things like modernization and advancement, but of course, the environment is very important, and that should also be pretty hammered home. But that's enough yap. If you agreed with it, well, make sure to let me know in the comments down below. And if you have any more suggestions for this October run of Cryptid Corner, where we're looking at the creepier cryptids this month, make sure to comment it down below. I always love reading your comments. But if you like this video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel and ring that bell so that you are notified for every upload on the channel the second it comes out. But if you just can't wait and you want to get these videos early, make sure to become a member for $3 a month. You help out an immense bit and gain access to videos early. You're right here at the end of the video with all the food, all the pals, and the big beluga. But most importantly, you're an absolute real one. But you're a real one regardless, just for getting this far in the video. So again, I'd like to thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next installment of Cryptid Corner. It should be a pretty good one. It's a pretty well-known story this time around. The only hint I'll give is West Virginia.